here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Next subject will be Unit 8, which is substantial improvement and substantial damage. We've talked a little bit about that throughout the last day and a half. I want to give you guys some specific examples of where this comes into play and how it gets administered, along with some diagrams, which might make your head spin a little bit after a while. They get very specific, but it also kind of gives some good examples of when you might see this. So just as an intro to this topic, I want to revisit how the National Flood Insurance Program was set up from the beginning, which was a day forward set of regulations once maps are established and regulations adopted for a particular community. That date, when the first map is created, separates what we call pre-firm versus post-firm structures. Post-firm structures should always conform to and be compliant with whatever floodplain regulations are in place at the time of the construction. Now, maps can change, and so substantial improvement and substantial damage can still be triggered for these structures in certain instances. But the vast majority of where we see these kind of processes come into play will be with pre-firm structures. So the NFIP was always meant to be a program of attrition where infrastructure that was already in place prior to the first map for a community doesn't get punished for building in the absence of a map and a code, and is allowed to remain in place even after the map and the code comes into play. But I call it a program of attrition because once a certain action gets taken, whether a building is damaged or whether it gets improved, the building then must be brought into compliance so that there are fewer remaining pre-firm structures in place, if that makes sense. So we're going to be talking about substantial improvement and substantial damage here. Just my own editorial comment, I would say of the two, I think the substantial improvement is by far the more complicated of the two for a number of reasons, but we'll go through the processes that take place with each one of these. And again, I'm not used to doing this without back and forth, but if you have any questions, go ahead and submit them and we'll answer them at the appropriate time. Okay, I was afraid this, oh, there we go. Okay. We put up on the screen the number 50%. Why do we make such a big deal out of that? Because that's the number that, of course, triggers these two processes. Keep that in mind as we move forward. Substantial improvement talks about reconstruction, rehabilitation, remodeling, addition, or any other improvement to a structure whereby the cost of the improvement project over the market value of the building is greater than or equal to 50%. Substantial damage is basically the same process, except that rather than an improvement or some way of modifying the building, we're talking about repairing it from some kind of damage. Now, I'll just ask you to think to yourself, which of these two are harder to figure out? Is it the numerator or is it the denominator? I'll let you just kind of ponder that for a second. I will just say they both have their challenges, and we're going to go over kind of how to navigate those challenges right here. Okay, so dealing with the costs included. So let me go back. So the costs, we're now talking about the numerator of the project. So whether it's improvement or repairs. Here are the costs that are included within that number: structural items and major building components, interior finish elements, utility and service equipment, market value of all labor and materials. You should have all of these in the calculation when you figure that out. So it's never this simple, of course, but just to illustrate how the process works, you've got a house that costs $100,000, so it's probably nowhere within Colorado, but for the ease of keeping the numbers simple, an improvement cost comes in, and using the method that you figure out to calculate that, it comes into $60,000. Therefore, the cost divided by the market value or whatever value you use to calculate the denominator is now 60%. That's over the 50%, therefore it's a substantial improvement. Okay, kind of a restatement in some cases, but let's go ahead and go through this. What is included in the project costs? You can see all of those right there. I'll let you read them at your leisure, but I do want to talk about at the bottom the 2 exemptions to calculating the cost. The first talks about improvements to correct code violations. And what do we mean by that? And I always struggle to explain this. So if anybody has anything to add, go ahead and jump in here. But let's just say that you live in a very old building that doesn't meet current code for either, let's just say electricity and plumbing. Let's say your building's 150 years old and all of the current codes, you don't meet any of them. And you want to bring these up to a current code status. If you're concerned about your building catching on fire or flooding out because your sewer doesn't work or something like that, whatever. The intent is not to punish property owners by throwing the substantial improvement on them just because they're trying to correct obvious safety problems that makes their home safer to live in. So I hope that makes sense. If you've got a serious pre-firm building that, let's say, has a lowest floor well below the base flood elevation, we don't want to discourage property owners from making the necessary safety improvements because they don't want to bring the building into compliance from a floodplain management standpoint. I hope that makes sense. I can't see any head nods, but if you have any questions on that, go ahead and put them in the chat. The other one, which we've talked about, is historic buildings. Now, this is not just a blanket exemption. It doesn't just mean because the building is on the register that it can just flat out ignore any kind of floodplain regulations. It still says you have to do what you can in the case of, let's say, an improvement or a damage, I suppose. But if you lose the historic aspect of the building due to something that you have to do to meet a floodplain regulation, it does allow some permissivity to be able to ignore some of those specific requirements. But the key is that you still have to do what you can if you can still maintain the historic status. Okay, here are some exceptions to the project costs. I'm not going to read through all of these. I'll leave this slide up for a little bit, but just I'll just give you a few seconds to look through this and see if there's anything that jumps out at you. And again, if any of this causes any confusion, go ahead and throw it in the chat and we can talk about this at the appropriate time. Okay, an important provision regarding costs. You must figure the true cost of bringing the building back to its pre-improvement and pre-damage condition. Okay, so for example, in the case of, let's just say, a substantial damage, you're trying to bring it back to what happened before the flood or before the fire or before the tornado or whatever it is that caused the damage. You should be calculating really what it costs if you were to hire somebody to do the work and they charge you an appropriate cost to do that. If you do the work yourself and save all that money from doing that, you should not be deducting that from the price to repair the damage. I hope that makes sense. Some key points on substantial damage. It can be from any cause. Just, this is a flood program, but just because a building is damaged by a fire or a tornado or anything like that, the substantial damage can still kick in. Doesn't matter if you have flood insurance or not. You still have to meet that requirement. Okay. This next one kind of builds on what I said on the last slide. The cost to repair the structure must be calculated for the full repair. So not only can you not deduct costs because you're doing your own work, but you also can't say, well, I didn't need that function in my building anyway, so even though it got damaged, I'm not going to fix that part, so therefore don't count that. No. You have to consider what it would take to bring it back before the damage condition in terms of deciding the calculation. It doesn't mean you have to make the fix, but it does mean you have to at least include it in the calculation for this subject. It must also include the cost of any improvements that the owner has opted to include during the repair project. So even if you're doing a repair from a damage, let's say that it's only a 45% calculation to repair the work, but then you do all these upgrades to the project, which basically kicks it over 50%, that would apply in that case. Okay, so here are just some ways to get project cost and building values. So again, on the left side, you're seeing the numerator to the equation, and on the right side, you're seeing the denominator. Both can be kind of tricky. So how can you get project costs? There's some examples right there. But basically, I mean, if you just go to a bunch of contractors and kind of get a feel for what the average cost might be, you can submit that as the cost of the project. The market value, you can find that from a number of different sources, which you can see right here. I don't necessarily think one is any better than the other inherently, but you can ask for a specific one of these as a local floodplain administrator. Say, this is what I'd like to see, and this is what I'm going to put in the denominator of the equation. Or if the applicant is willing to provide any of these and they seem technically sound, any one of these are acceptable to use. Okay, we talk about market value. Let's see what we want to emphasize. I'll let you read this, but I think the third bullet and is one that I really want to emphasize here, which is when you're trying to calculate the value of the structure that is either being repaired or improved, you want it to be the cost, or excuse me, the value of the structure itself and not the value of all the land around that. Okay, so don't include just the parcel that the structure is on. It should be the parcel itself. If you see anything else here that looks of any concern, go ahead and make note of that, and I'd be happy to discuss that at the appropriate time. Okay, now we're going to go into some examples, starting easier and getting progressively harder. So the first one talks about a minor rehabilitation. So I'll just walk you through each one of these slides. Again, the first few are fairly simple, and the last couple may trip me up. They always do when I present this. So this is a pre-firm building and is not a substantial improvement. So what's going on right here, you've got a pre-firm building where you can clearly see that the lowest floor is below the base flood elevation. And the improvements consist of new flood-resistant materials for a new floor, and also a new air conditioner for the house. So again, we've already calculated that the number is less than 50%, so this is not a substantial improvement. So what would you require? Well, if it's not a substantial improvement, you would not require that the entire building be elevated to put the lowest floor at or above the base flood elevation. So the floor can remain where it is. But you'll see what's going on here is we're saying, well, because the air conditioner is a new feature, and because it really doesn't affect the rest of the house in the sense that it's not a structural element of the house, that really should be put in above the base flood elevation, which it is right here. I do want to take a step back for a second and just remind everybody what happens when the substantial improvement or substantial damage calculation is triggered. So you've got that 50% calculation. What does that mean? We've already talked about it, but I would like to review it. What that means is not only does the work that's being done as part of this project, whether it's an improvement or a repair, not only does that have to be compliant with current standards, but now you also have to bring the entire structure itself into compliance, okay? That's what that substantial provision requires, okay? But in this case, I just want to reiterate that this is not a substantial improvement, but the air conditioner is still something new that's not structural, which is why it should still be put in above the base flood elevation, but the floor can remain where it is. Okay, now we're going to look at a substantial rehabilitation. So you've calculated that it exceeds the 50%. And so what that means is not only the new improvements, but also the entire structure has to be brought into current code. Okay, so this was a pre-firm building. You can see that it's got the lowest floor below the base flood elevation. It's even got that air conditioner below the base flood elevation. And it looks like the house is built on a stem wall, which is very short. And so what is needing to be done here, and I guess I don't know what the substantial improvement is. I mean, you can see that they put new windows in. I don't know what else they did with the house, but it's substantial. Okay, so what needs to happen here then is that the entire structure must be brought into compliance. So you talked earlier in the regulations section about what to do for a property like this on stem walls, and that is you can elevate it to move the first floor above the base flood elevation. But if you just stop right there, what have you done? You have made the bottom of that crawl space your lowest floor, okay? And how you get around doing that is by punching these flood openings into that now extended stem wall. And the flood openings, if they're properly installed, that's a process called wet flood proofing. That allows water to go in through the flood openings and out the other side. And by regulation, what that does is it exempts the bottom of the crawl space from being the lowest floor and makes the first floor the actual lowest floor for regulations and insurance. And you can see that that is now raised up above the base flood elevation. Also note the other thing that they did here was they elevated the air conditioner so that it is also above the base flood elevation. Okay, moving on. Now we are looking at a lateral addition. And this is where things also, there's kind of another wrinkle that gets added in right here. This is a pre-firm building, and you can see the original building is the structure on the right there. It's built so that its lowest floor is below the base flood elevation, and the property owner wants to come in and build a lateral addition to the right, okay? And it says on the bottom there, the proposed work is only the addition. So the key thing here is that there's no structural change made to the common wall in between there, which means that let's say something were to happen to that lateral addition and make it non-functional, the original building is still a structurally sound and stable structure on its own. Okay, so you've still got a structural wall in the middle that hasn't been knocked out. You probably have a set of stairs leading from the original building to that lateral addition. And because that structural wall has not been modified and there's no improvements to the original building, you actually are allowed in this case to keep the original building where it's at. Now you still have to make the lateral addition compliant with current standards. So you can see they've done that by placing it on a stem wall there and putting the flood openings in there. It basically functions as kind of a separate building right there. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, now what's happening here, it's kind of a similar thing. So you've got a pre-firm building. This is considered to be a substantial improvement. They're putting a lateral addition in here. So everything is kind of similar to that last one. So it looks like here the original building is the lengthwise structure on the left with the lateral addition being put in on the right. The difference here though if you look on the bottom, the description, the proposed work includes an addition and work on the original building, including structural modification of the common wall and or roof. So now there is a structural change to the building, and that lateral addition essentially becomes, in every sense, part of the original building. So in that case, you can't use that exemption, and therefore, because this is a substantial improvement, the entire structure has to be elevated here. And they did that by raising it up on this stem wall and putting the flood openings in there. And now the entire structure is compliant with local elevation requirements. Okay, on the next one, we have a lateral addition, a non-residential property that is a substantial improvement, okay? And again, if you read the lowest or the description of the project on the bottom, the proposed work is only the addition, no work on the existing building, no structural modification of the common wall or the roof, okay? So what happens in this case, you can see the original, I'll call it the commercial, I'll call it a store. It's a commercial property, it's non-residential. The original building is on the left, the addition is on the right, which is a structurally separate building from the original one. So what happens is that the addition has to be built in compliance to the base flood elevation, but the original building can remain where it is. So what they have done here is they have basically poured that concrete foundation up high and elevated that addition with a ramp leading into that and allowed the original building to remain where it is. The next example is a residential property that has a vertical addition. So you hear about popping the top. That's basically what this is. I guess it doesn't say, does it say what zone? It just says any zone. I mean, when I look at a building like this, I think of the coast where buildings are built on these piles. I don't see a lot of this kind of construction in Colorado, but it does exist from time to time. So the building well, the structure before the project, which is on the left, shows a building on piles that is built with the lowest floor below the base flood elevation. This is a pre-firm building. And so what they want to do is pop the top, put a vertical addition on, making it a substantial improvement. So what they need to do, in addition to actually building the vertical addition itself, is they have to increase the length of those piles so that the original building is above the base flood elevation itself. And you can see that on the right. So they've basically increased the height and brought it up into compliance with current standards. Okay, the next example talks about a vertical addition in a non-residential structure. And so basically it's kind of like the last one. They want to pop the top on, let's just say, a commercial or an industrial building. I'll just refer to it as a store. And so basically what they have done here, because this is a commercial building and not residential, they've elected to leave the lowest floor where it is, but to dry flood-proof it to a point, to an elevation where it becomes compliant through flood-proofing rather than elevation. But because this is a substantial improvement, this action would be necessary. And so just recall some of the provisions that come into place when we talk about flood-proofing. First of all, for regulations, it's the same elevation as if they elevated it. So from national standards, they could elevate it right to the base flood elevation and that would be fine. It looks like on this drawing, they dry flood-proofed it a little bit higher than the base flood elevation. Why might they have done that? Well, there might have either been a freeboard requirement, such as there would be in Colorado, or the other thing, again, remember, is that they may know they have to get flood insurance after this action is taken. And they know that 1 foot will be subtracted from that dry flood-proofed elevation, and they want to make sure that they get a reasonably priced flood insurance policy. Okay. Okay, the next one talks about a post-firm building and a minor addition. So this one's a bit of a tricky thing because the idea is the original structure is a post-firm building. And so unless there's any indication that the map has changed the base flood elevation, which it doesn't say here, the idea is, well, because it's a post-firm building, it should have been built to a proper elevation to begin with. And it looks like it is here if you see that. And so they want to put an addition in that's not a substantial improvement. And what I would say is the addition also has to be built to the proper standard, but because the building on the left was built properly to begin with, there's really nothing that you need to do with it. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, and now this is where things start getting really tricky, and I often have to kind of explain my own way through this, so bear with me. So here we've got a lateral addition to a post-firm building on the left, built properly, I might add, to the base flood elevation that was in place at the time that building was built. However, over the years, there's been a restudy or there've been actions taken in the community, whatever, but for whatever reason, the map now shows that the base flood elevation is higher than it was to begin with, okay? Now let's read what they want to propose here. It says, the proposed work is a lateral addition with no work in the original building and no structural modification of the common wall or roof, and it constitutes a substantial improvement. So again, remember that as long as that original building can stand on its own with its own roof and all of its supporting elements, including the common wall, even if it's a substantial improvement, that building can remain at the base flood elevation, or at the first floor elevation that it's at. But now that we've got a lateral addition and a higher base flood elevation, that lateral addition has to be built to the new standard. And so what they've done is put that in there. Again, there's still going to be that common wall in between, probably with a doorway in the middle and some steps leading up to that new addition. But the old one can stay where it is. I hope that makes sense. Okay, and then this is the only one we have of substantial damage. Like I told you at the outset, I think the substantial damage is much easier to figure out than the addition. Here we've just got a pre-firm building that experienced a damage episode, whether it was flood, fire, it doesn't really say. And so it says that the building was totaled. And if you look on the left, you can see where the base flood elevation is, and you can see that the lowest floor was probably below that. It was a pre-firm building. But now that it's substantially damaged, you can't just rebuild it back the way it was before. It has to be built in compliance with the new standards. So what they basically did was elevated up the stem wall, put in the required flood openings right there, and now has the first floor above the base flood elevations with a wet flood-proof crawl space, which if the openings are properly installed will not count as the lowest floor of the new building. Okay, now keep in mind, just for the sake of the test, notice that little provision on the bottom. This example is for A zones only. A new building in the V zone must be elevated on piles or columns. They don't allow stem walls in V zones because those stem walls can fail and take the entire structure down with it in the event of wave action. Okay, 3 examples to the substantial improvement damage requirement, exempt activities. I believe I've got a slide on that. We already talked about historic buildings. Again, it's not just a blanket exemption, but it's allowing you to forgo certain floodplain regulations if by doing so it would remove the historic status of the building. We talked about projects required by code. We don't want to penalize people for fixing obvious safety violations in their property. Okay, here are some exempt activities that refer to what we talked about on the previous slide. Cleanup, contents. If you're not modifying the structure, but you're completely remodeling inside, that does not count. Design costs, outside improvements. So if you make landscaping changes, that does not get incorporated into the substantial calculation. Okay, just another slide about the historic structures. Building must be a bona fide historic structure, and how do you get that? It has to be on some kind of register, whether it's a national or a state. I suppose there might be a local list as well, but it has to have some kind of registration that clearly identifies it as a historic structure. And it's not just somebody saying, well, my house is 40 years old, it's been around for a while, therefore I think it's historic. Project must maintain the historic status of the structure, and again, all possible flood damage reduction measures must be taken. Okay, we've talked about projects required by code. I'll just let you read this for a second. It kind of goes with what I said earlier. And if you have any questions on this, we can certainly discuss that when we're down here. Okay, I don't believe we have discussed increased cost of compliance yet. I think Diana is going to be discussing some of this in Unit 9, but let me just introduce you to the concept right here. Increased cost of compliance, or you'll hear it referred to as ICC, is basically a rider on a flood insurance policy that is charged different amounts depending on different zones and different building types that allows for basically an allowance, if you will, that if your building is substantially damaged and meets certain requirements, then this money can become available for the purpose of bringing that structure into compliance when it is repaired. Okay, so let me go through these bullets right here. Refers to cases where the local floodplain ordinance requires elevation or retrofitting of a substantially damaged building. The flood insurance will pay up to $30,000. It's been like that ever since I took this, so I don't know if that number's changed. Diana can comment on that when she needs to. It covers the additional cost of complying with the ordinance. Okay, now let's, this last bullet's kind of important, and it's a bit of minutia, but just be aware of it in case they ask this on the test. It's available for any flood insurance claim. So it has to be substantial damage on an insured structure due to a flood, substantial damage or repetitive loss structure only, and it's not dependent on the community receiving a disaster declaration. Okay, so keep those points in mind. And again, I'm happy to discuss this when the time comes, but I'm pretty certain Diana's got this in Unit 9 as well, that we'll go over this again. Reviewing of basic rules. Any maintenance activity as part of the project, regulations, okay, pre and post firm buildings. Generally, I'll say this applies to pre-firm buildings for the most part, but it can apply in instances like that one diagram that I showed where you had a post-firm building, but then was subject to a map change, which increased the base flood elevation. In that case, even a post-firm building can be subject to these provisions. All new additions to a post-firm building have to be built at or above the base flood elevation. The only thing that comes into play is if the original structure remains structurally independent, it can avoid the substantial damage requirements. Substantial improvements to to residential structures must be elevated to the new base flood elevation. And as always, non-residential structures may be flood-proofed. It can be flood-proof to the base flood elevation, but remember they subtract a foot for insurance. And then look at the total project cost. Okay, FEMA gives community rating system credit for communities that keep track of home improvement applications in order to keep tabs on cumulative substantial damage improvement. And so what that means is the basic minimum requirements are project by project. So a property owner could come in and propose an addition to their house, let's say, and the proposed cost of that addition is 40% of the home's original value. Is that a substantial improvement? It's not, because it's less than 50%. Now, let's say that that same property owner comes in 10 years later and says, now I want to do another improvement project. And this one is going to cost 30% of what the pre-project value of the house is. Now you might say, well, you already did a 40% project and now you want to come in with another 30%. Is that a substantial damage? According to minimum FEMA requirements, if they are completely separate projects, separated by time and intent, that does not trigger a substantial damage need. They are independent projects and can remain so. But what the city or whatever the local government, whatever they do have the option at the local level to say, we are going to track this and employ what we call cumulative substantial damage or substantial improvements. And what that means is we will tie those projects together. And if it does exceed 50% as a suite of projects, then it does trigger the cumulative or the substantial requirements. Again, that is a voluntary community decision. I think it's a great idea personally, but the NFIP minimums do not require it, but you do get community rating system credit as the community if you decide to employ that. FEMA has developed a substantial damage software program, and you can see the call outs for what they are right there. They will help with making calculations, especially in a disaster when it's possible that numerous structures have been damaged and you need to make some very quick determinations as to whether a building is substantially damaged for the sake of whether a permit should be issued for repair. And that is the end of my section. So at this point, let me see how we're doing on time. I'm out of time, but I'm more than happy to take any questions either through the chat or if anybody would like to ask them now.
Kevin, Pam and Mark asked questions related to the cumulative substantial damage improvements, but if they have any other clarifications that they need, they can chime in at this point.
Did they ask them before I got to that?
Yes, they did.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer anything else that you have if there's something specific in regards to that.
You know, Kevin, it's ironic that you use the 10-year example on addressing that next last bullet. The flood district, Mile High Flood District, adopted a new set of floodplain ordinances that would apply to any communities in the district. And they had a 10-year milestone in there. But there was enough consternation among local agencies on having to apply that they rescinded that provision this year and have left it up to the local municipality to adopt a cumulative review approach.
I have to confess I wasn't aware that they did that. I am personally a fan of the cumulative substantial damage and improvement process, but I certainly recognize and appreciate that can create a paperwork headache for tracking at the local level. So I can understand why a community would want to do it.
Caitlin asks, is slide 27 for ICC or a review of basic rules for substantial improvements and damage?
Okay, I assume I'm on 27 right here. I can't see my number because I've got...
That's 26.
You're on 26.
Okay, so this is 27 right here.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, what was the question?
Is it for ICC or a review of basic rules?
Oh, this is just a review of just basic rules in general, not related specifically to ICC.
So this is Diana. I just want to make just one quick comment. You can do cumulative substantial improvement or damage, or if you've got repetitive loss properties in your community, those that have flood more than 2 times in a 10-year period. You can also add that to your ordinance. A little easier to administer than the cumulative, but it would address those structures that flood repeatedly to bring them into compliance.
We will have a question and answer session at the end of this webinar, so I think we should move on to Unit 9.
All right. Thank you, everybody.